All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You've been busy digging into the world of Indian startups, and you've given us quite the collection of sources to work with. We've got academic papers, articles, even some pretty lively discussions from Reddit. So, ready to unpack all of
I
this?
think so. It's like you've handed us a puzzle box. You know,
Yeah.
all these pieces, data, opinions, success stories, warnings, and we need to figure out how it all fits together. Why is India's startup scene booming, but at the same time, so many of them fail?
Yeah, it is a real head scratcher. I mean, just look at the numbers. This academic paper, analyzing factors contributing to startup failures in India, states that India has the third largest startup ecosystem in the world, over 117,000 DPIIT recognized startups.
And DPIT, for those who don't know, stands for Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade. Basically, the government body that, recognizes and keeps track of all the startups.
Exactly. But here's the catch.
Over 90% of them fail in the first 5 years. That's even higher than the global average. And from what I saw in those Reddit discussions, a lot of people think it's actually closer to 80%, specifically in India.
So it's this strange mix. Huge growth, but so many failures. It's like a rocket taking off with a parachute that might not even open.
Yeah. And then you add on top of that the fact that startup funding in India dropped by a massive 73% in 2023 compared to 2022. That definitely adds to the uncertainty.
It does make you wonder, is this all sustainable? Or is it all going to come crashing down? And it makes you think about the root of this growth. Is it genuine innovation, or are these companies just copying what works in the West, the so-called copy-paste model?
Yeah, and the Reddit threads were on fire about that.
They really were. You've got Zomato, it's basically India's Yelp. Then there's Ola, which is like India's Uber. And Flipkart started out basically as Amazon. So how do you even stand out when the market is already saturated with familiar concepts?
And that's where understanding the Indian consumer becomes super important. It's not enough to just, take an idea from Silicon Valley and drop it in India.
Yeah.
You got to think about the culture, affordability, the infrastructure. What works in California might not work in Chennai.
For sure. And then there's all this pressure to get funding. The Reddit discussions made it sound like founders are obsessed with chasing venture capital money. Sometimes even if it means sacrificing, a profitable business model.
Right, and it can be this awful cycle. Startups trying to grow as fast as possible to impress investors, burning through cash, focusing on valuations instead of building a solid base. It's almost like trying to build a skyscraper on quicksand.
Oh, and speaking of shaky ground, the sources also talked about how this need to scale so quickly creates a burn rate culture. Basically, startups spend more money than they're making, hoping to grow fast and attract more investment. But that's risky, isn't it?
Incredibly risky. It makes you wonder, what are the investors thinking? Are they really supporting these companies for the long haul? Or are they encouraging this unsustainable growth at all costs mindset? I think that's a big thing for anyone who wants to start a company to consider. What are your goals? And do your investors share those goals?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the copy-paste problem and the funding frenzy, but we can't forget about the challenges that are unique to the Indian market itself. Things like price sensitivity. Indian consumers are really careful with their money, and they expect good value. That can be a challenge for startups that are used to charging higher prices.
Right. Startups need to understand the Indian market. You can't just assume that what works in other countries will work in India.
And then there's the whole talent situation. Reddit was full of stories about the brain drain. The most talented people choose to work for established companies instead of startups because it's more stable and the benefits are better. And then on top of that, you've got inexperienced founders who are, maybe struggling with leadership and creating toxic workplaces.
Yeah, building a strong team is key. But it's not just about technical skills. You need vision, strong leadership, and a healthy company culture. If you've got people constantly quitting and fighting with each other, you're not going to be able to navigate this market.
It's like trying to win a race with a flat tire and a team that's arguing with each other. And then, just to add another layer of complexity, there's the government. Lots of people on Reddit talked about all the bureaucracy, policies that are outdated, and a lack of support from the government.
And this is where the government's role is so important. Can they simplify things, modernize their policies, create a better environment for startups to succeed? These are all important questions for policymakers in India.
Okay, so we've got all these challenges, but there's one more thing that kept coming up on Reddit that I wanted to mention. A lot of founders seem to be focused on a quick exit, selling their company to make a profit instead of building something sustainable that will last.
It makes you think, what's the point of starting a company? Is it just about making a quick buck? Or is it about building something that has real value and solves real problems?
It's like building a sandcastle on the beach that's just going to get washed away by the tide. Do you want to build something temporary or do you want to build something that will last? Something like a lighthouse that can withstand any storm.
I think maybe this is a good place to pause for a moment. We've talked a lot about the challenges that Indian startups face, but it's not all bad news, right? Definitely not. The source has also highlighted some amazing advantages that India has to offer startups. But let's save those for after a short break.
Stay tuned because next we're going to explore what makes India such an exciting and potentially rewarding place to launch a startup.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about why India is such a hot spot for startups. Because even with all the challenges we just talked about, there's a reason why so many people are excited about this market.
Yeah, I mean, even those intense Reddit debates couldn't ignore the fact that India has some serious advantages. The biggest one that jumps out is just the sheer size of the market. We're talking about 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of potential customers. And they're becoming more and more connected and comfortable with technology every day.
It's a game changer. If you can get even a small percentage of that market, the growth potential is insane. Not many other countries can offer that.
And to build products for all those people, you need talent. And India has that in spades. Tons of skilled engineers and developers, all at a really competitive cost. That's something that kept coming up on Reddit. It's a huge draw for startups.
Absolutely. Having access to that kind of talent is a major advantage, especially when you're trying to grow quickly. And it's not just the quantity, it's the quality too. India has world-class engineers.
Now, we talked earlier about how government policies can be a bit of a roadblock, but the sources also mentioned some positive initiatives. Things like the Startup India program and different incentives for MSMEs, those micro, small, and medium enterprises. That's got to help, right?
It does. It shows the government is at least trying to be supportive of entrepreneurs. The question is, are these initiatives actually effective? Are they really addressing the biggest challenges?
Yeah, good point. But there's another factor that kept popping up in the sources that I think is really important. Mobile penetration. India has a ton of people using the internet, and smartphones are becoming more and more affordable.
And that opens up huge opportunities for startups in all sorts of sectors, like e-commerce, fintech, digital services, areas where you might struggle in countries that aren't as digitally connected.
So let's recap. We've got this massive market, tons of talented people, some government support, and a rapidly growing digital landscape. That's a pretty powerful combination.
No doubt about it. And it's not just about the domestic market either. Indian startups are starting to think globally. They're looking at expanding to other emerging markets around the world.
It's impressive they're taking what they've learned from navigating this complex market in India and using it to explore new opportunities. Okay, so we've got this picture of a really dynamic ecosystem with tons of potential, but we can't forget about that high failure rate we talked about earlier. And this is where I think that unicorn paradox comes in.
Yes, the unicorn paradox. You know, those unicorns, those startups that are valued at over $1 billion, they seem to fail less often, but when they do, it's a much bigger deal. It's more public, more devastating.
Right, like the article, the year 2024 has been a mixed bag for India, talked about, right? BYJUS, Meesho, PharmEasy, all these unicorns that have seen their valuations plummet.
Exactly. And it's not just an Indian phenomenon. Think about Proteus Digital Health, Packable, Reef Technologies, Zwift. These international unicorns raised huge amounts of money, got those sky-high valuations, and then poof.
It's like a reminder that becoming a unicorn too early can be a dangerous thing. It creates pressure to grow at any cost, even if it means doing things that aren't sustainable, and that can lead to a really painful crash.
I think it emphasizes the need for a more balanced approach. Investors and founders both need to be careful not to get caught up in the hype and instead focus on building solid businesses that can actually make money, not just reach some arbitrary valuation.
So with all these factors in play, the challenges, the advantages, the unicorn paradox, what does the future hold for Indian startups? What can we learn from all of this?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And luckily, there are organizations like FICCI, that's the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and the Standing Committee on Commerce. They've made some recommendations. They're suggesting things like simplifying regulations, streamlining the registration process, and getting rid of that pesky angel tax. Those could all be really positive steps.
Wait, hold on a sec. Can you explain what that angel tax is? It sounds like something out of a fairy tale. Or a nightmare, depending on who you ask.
It does sound a bit whimsical, doesn't it? But for startups, it's definitely more of a headache. Basically, it's this tax that the government puts on investments that startups get from angel investors if the share price is considered too high. A lot of people argue that it discourages investment, especially in those early stages when startups need it most.
Okay, that makes sense. So getting rid of that angel tax could be a big help for startups trying to get funding. So let's shift focus for a minute and talk about our listeners. What does all of this mean for someone who's thinking about starting a company in India?
I think the biggest takeaway is focus on real innovation. Don't just copy something that works somewhere else. Find a problem in the Indian market that needs solving and come up with a solution that actually adds value.
Right. And from what we've discussed, it's clear that understanding the Indian consumer is essential. What do they need? What do they want? What are they willing to pay for? These are all crucial things to think about.
Absolutely. And building a strong, adaptable team is also incredibly important. You need people who believe in your vision, who are passionate about solving the problem you're tackling, and who can handle the ups and downs that come with the startup world.
For sure. And don't forget about those government policies and regulations. You got to know how to navigate that system.
Yep. But maybe the most important thing to remember is to focus on building a business that's sustainable for the long haul. Don't get distracted by the hype of quick exits and unicorn valuations. Build something you're proud of, something that makes a difference, and something that has the potential to last.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen the incredible growth, the harsh realities of failure, the advantages, the challenges, and the cautionary tales of those fallen unicorns. It's been quite a journey. But I think we've managed to paint a pretty good picture of what the Indian startup ecosystem is all about: complex, constantly changing, and full of possibilities.
It's a story that's still unfolding, and despite all the obstacles, there's a sense of optimism and resilience in the Indian startup scene that's really inspiring.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on all of this? What questions do you have? What insights did you glean from our exploration of this fascinating topic? It's been quite the deep dive, hasn't it? We've really gone from those exciting growth numbers to the tough reality of the failure rates and everything in between. What's sticking with you the most from all of this?
It's easy to, get excited about those billion-dollar valuations and the hype, but I think we've seen that there's so much more to it than that. The Indian startup scene is kind of like a fast-moving river. Lots of energy and potential, but there's some dangerous currents too.
I like that, a fast-moving river. And even with those dangerous currents, there's the sense of optimism, a resilience that you can't ignore. Maybe it's that entrepreneurial spirit, that willingness to take risks and push the boundaries that keeps things moving forward.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think the next generation of entrepreneurs has a real advantage. They can learn from the successes, but also the mistakes of those who came before them. There's a lot of knowledge and experience they can draw from.
Exactly. It's like having a map that shows you not just the best route, but also all the dead ends and wrong turns. That's so valuable when you're trying to navigate a tricky landscape.
The question is, will they actually listen to those lessons?
Yeah.
Will they prioritize real innovation, building something sustainable and valuable, even if it takes a little longer to reach success?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? Will this next generation of Indian startups be able to learn from the past and build companies that not only achieve those crazy valuations, but also last for the long haul? I guess we'll have to wait and see how the story unfolds.
That's right. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.